Hey guys, welcome to Keystroke Medium, the show for readers, writers, and everyone in between. I'm your host, Lauren Moore, and with me is Ken Britz, military science fiction author, and he's written a new short story for our space opera anthology, Farthest Reach. So Ken, welcome to the show.
Hi Lauren, how are you?
Awesome.
Nice to be here.
Mostly I'm impressed by this sweater.
You like it?
We already talked about it in the pre-show, but what's going on with this sweater?
It's my favorite ugly sweater, which is not actually ugly.
It's not ugly at all.
I think only what would make it more patriotic is if it said USA in lights.
Yeah.
Maybe an 8.
It's like Avengers, Captain America.
I get lots of compliments when I wear it, even around town. People notice it. So.
To me, it looks like you're pushing back on the ugly sweater thing. Like, you want an ugly sweater? I'm going to wear an awesome sweater. Thank you.
That's right, and it's surprisingly very comfortable. Most ugly sweaters are cheap acrylic. This one's, I like it. It even has the shield on the back, if I could show that to you.
Oh, cool. So in case anyone attacks you from the back.
That's right.
Good.
Yeah, hit me right here. It's more like a target.
Rick Partlow, he says he also loves the sweater.
I agree. Captain America agrees. Start over.
Ellen is also here. And we've got
this is called In Media Res.
Yeah, in the middle of the action. Walt says, wait. Vas es los?
What is this? Another show on the same day? Why, yes.
Yes. Yeah, 2 shows on the same day. It's a double hitter. Very good. All right.
I don't think she loves the sweater. She doesn't like it.
No, Ellen must love the sweater. Ellen, tell us in chat whether or not you love the sweater. The sweater's great.
She's like, no, it's not a Crimson Tide sweater. See? I'm sorry, Alabama, not Crimson Tide. That's movie. Oh, wait, that is also Alabama.
Roll Tide. We'll just say it for Ellen, everyone. Roll Tide. All right. So we're here to talk about your books, your writing, and talk about you. So for our audience who has yet to meet the Ken Britz, who is Ken Britz? What does he write? What's he all about? Tell us it all.
Okay. Hi, my name is Ken Britz. I am a science fiction and fantasy writer, although the science fiction is what I'm writing and loving the most right now. I am a 22-year veteran of the United States Navy, 11 years active duty, 11 years in the reserves. I am a commander in the United States Navy, and on the civilian side, I am in technical sales. That's the best way to describe it. I work between sales and engineering.
Wow.
I have loved science fiction fantasy since I was a teenager. Probably before that, the comic books, or I should say the stories that come to mind was Isaac Asimov's I, Robot was probably my first true science fiction novel, and fantasy, I think it was actually Spell for Chameleon, and that's led me straight into Tolkien. I've been writing off and on since I was in my teens. I have lots of legal pads that never got translated to computer. But after I came back from deployment in 2012, I was deployed to Africa for about a year or so. While I was out there, I've been doing the National Novel Writing Month.
Oh, wow.
Not religiously, but every year for like 4 years, and I had done it. The first year was like the first attempt, and the second year was another attempt, and the third year was another attempt. I succeeded every year, but I tried to write something different. In the fourth year, I wrote the second half of the first thing that I wrote, which ended up becoming my first novel. And then, 2012, I came back. I'm going to say abandoned it. I put it aside. I worked on my master's degree, got back into civilian life and Navy Reserve life, and finished my MBA and go, well, what do I want to do next? And as a person that is goal-oriented likes to do, is you look at your 10-year goals and you say, why is publishing a novel still on my list? And I didn't do anything with it. 2015 through 2017, I spent a year and a half, 2 years working on that first novel. So, and I'm still writing. So that's who I am.
That's awesome. So you had an idea, you went after it, you put in the effort year after year after year, and you didn't give up.
No, I don't like to quit. So, and to talk about the story that I wrote for you, and we were mentioning it on the pre-show, I haven't written really a true space opera, and this is pre-Mandalorian, so please don't hate me. I thought, well, I like space western type stories, and if anybody in the chat can remember an old show called The Galaxy Rangers, and I think there was called one called The Lone Star, and that became kind of a small seed that became a short story that is in your anthology.
Yeah, your main character is a man of mystery.
Yeah, I obviously realized that I am a fan of characters with literally no names. So I dabbled in writing a couple short stories this last couple of years, and every character has no actual name. So, and he's one of them.
He might have a strong name, but he does have a strong story. Like there's a whole backstory that happened before you get to the one that, like, it's like a snapshot of his larger life. A snapshot that does have, like an inciting incident, and then it does have a conclusion at the end. But you can tell it's part of this bigger narrative.
That's the what's the phrase goes is the tip of the iceberg, right? You have this story underneath, and you see the little piece above.
The little piece.
Walt knows the Galaxy Rangers. You know what I'm talking about, right? Gooseman.
Walt knows.
Walt knows. I was super addicted to Saturday morning cartoons. One of my favorites.
Is that where your main character came from Galaxy Rangers, or another source?
No, it really came from. I think Galaxy Ranger made me think of it, and I was like, well, that's ensemble cast. It doesn't work for a short story. So I thought maybe a Lone Ranger type story. And I think that worked out pretty well with the character as, of course, a Lone Ranger type with a Chewbacca-like companion, or Tonto, I suppose. And also he has his own ship, just like Trigger. So I really enjoyed writing that, and I'm glad you guys like it.
Yeah. Well, for authors who are trying to figure out like how to start and stop a story, knowing that your main character has, his story begins before the beginning, and it's going to continue on after the ending of the short story. How do you decide where to open up a story and where to close it?
That's a good question. I used to write at the beginning, and that's always terrible because when you write the beginning of the beginning, it's all in info dump, right? So what I usually do is I start when I write I'll just open up a Scrivener document, and I'll just start writing a history and technology or facts and things that I want to put into the story until I get to a point where I think something has started. And that's where I kind of cut the line and said, okay, this is where the story will begin. So in the story, of course, he's a combat veteran post, some sort of massacre, which is very similar to the Old West. And that's kind of where the story fits, where he's dealing with those former issues. I can't admit to having those issues. I don't have PTSD. But I wanted to write a character that was trying to deal with the fallout of the life that he had before and trying to manage around that. So.
Well, we're all really happy that you don't have PTSD, and we're also thankful for your service.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I have my own sort of PTSD on being in a submarine, but it doesn't really compare to a true combat veteran. things.
So you've just been writing so many stories enough to get a feel for a good place to kind of start the story.
Yes. So I will tell you the first novel that I wrote and published. I left all that in, and the book was way too big. And I took it to a developmental editor, and they said, "That's a lot of information. Even the pseudoscience was way too much and way over their heads in detail in describing how the technology works for basically what's an Arthurian legend story." So, and also as amateur writers or beginning writers or want to do, you want to write a prologue. That's not helpful. The prologue only helps if there's a piece of information that belongs in the story that it doesn't exist early enough to understand what it's for, or doesn't relate to the story until the right moment. And I wrote that prologue, and I wrote many of those prologues. I stopped writing prologues.
Like, I'm done.
Yeah, the development there was like, please stop doing that. I don't like it when you do that. So those prologues became, like I said, the backstory material that I would just throw into a folder and keep going.
What are some other tips you've learned along the way of like working with editors? What are some other tips about writing and writing craft that you've developed or discovered through writing?
So something I've learned about writing that I've gotten from my professional experience is always take the ego out of the equation. The editor is never out to degrade you or your writing. It's always, the goal is to improve the writing. So don't be offended when they tell you you write poorly, or you write too wordy, or in some cases that you let a scene go on longer than it should. Just take that, especially as a beginning writers, take that advice to heart and try to just study other people that have done it successfully and go back and say, yeah, I understand. I understand what you're saying, and I'll take that advice. Sometimes you don't have to always take their advice, but in developmental edits, a good developmental editor, you probably take about 90% of their advice. And when you get to the copy edit, that's about 99% of their advice. Because
sure.
Ellen will tell you, I am, and you have edited my works, it's not perfect.
Hey, Ellen agrees with you 100%, it sounds like.
Yeah, Ellen edited my last book, so.
Yeah, and she would also tell you her suggestions, they're just suggestions. They're not gospel. Roll Tide might be gospel, or at least close to it. But our editor suggestion, you're still the author, still no. But yeah, she's totally on your team. Your editor hopefully is a good one and is on your team and is just trying to help that story be better. As an editor, sometimes I worry, like, is this being too harsh, whatever the criticism is. But then on the author side of the equation, I want that. I want to know what I'm not doing right or how I can do better so I can make this story better.
Well, you need to couch it in terms of the story, not the person, right?
Sure.
So what's, you can always say, what's wrong with this character? Why is, often what I get from my copy editors is, why did that character say that? Because there's no reason for them to have said that before. Because the wrong character said it, oftentimes. So a lot, and oftentimes when a character says something that doesn't make sense to the editor, I would find that 9 times out of 10, if I delete that sentence, nobody would have noticed because I had written it with an idea in mind, and I don't remember what I wrote. Why?
Yeah. It's funny how much you can cut out, and then it's great, if not better, that way. With whatever it is cut out. But does that experience ever surprise you, where a reader picks up on something about your characters? You thought you knew your characters so well, right? They're coming from your imagination, but the reader picks up on something you didn't notice.
Sorry.
That's awesome. Maybe what of this? You want the real?
Ran past my room.
Yeah, you're dadding well. You're dadding well. This is great. But does that experience, like, what's that like to have a reader pick up on something on your characters or your plot, and they're the product of your imagination, and yet the reader sees something that you didn't even see, and it sounds right?
It's often, it actually is pretty surprising when someone says, "Did you know that your character is very similar to?" And I'm like, I never heard of that other thing before. I must have done something that reminds you of, another character in another story that's very similar.
Yeah.
And I find that very flattering. I love when someone does that. So. The other thing that I've learned is characterization is important, but also pacing is very important.
What do you mean by that?
Well, let's go back to my first book. It's a slow start because it is quite literally an origin story. So it does all of the things that you would think that would be in an origin story, but an origin story in a movie would be a montage. But mine is successive scenes. And it's not until you get to the 2/3 part of the book that the story just takes off like a rocket. So it's a very slow burn. And you can lose readers like that. You can absolutely lose readers by saying they got 30% through the book and said, it was very slow. And then I've got readers that said, I hung out and the last 30% just took off, and I had to hold on. So I've learned that in successive books to keep the pace a little, you want that fast pace at the end because that's exciting, but you have to also keep the pace in the beginning and middle to be a little bit up and down even, so that the reader is still turning the page. That's a huge lesson I learned both from my editors and from my readers.
Steve Lloyd says, slow burns are like cigars, acquired taste.
I like a good cigar, yes.
So what advice would you give to an author who's looking at their first draft of a novel and they've got a sense, maybe their editor told them, maybe a beta reader told them, or they just know themselves that the first 2/3 are slow burn and then the last third is exciting. How could they go about deciding what to cut or change or revise? Like what could they do with the first draft like that?
A couple things. I'm, of course, a huge fan of Star Wars, but I don't know if you realize this or not, but George Lucas wrote an entire treatment of all 9 episodes. And he looked at the massive number of pages that he wrote and said that, and then he picked episode 4 to start because the first 3 were not enough to grab the viewer initially. Right. So think of it that way. If you have that slow burn, maybe you could just imagine yourself starting at a quick point in the story and going forward. And can you add some of the elements from that first 2/3 and fill out a story that kind of goes like a roller coaster rather than a very long slog uphill?
What do you look for to pick out that scene? Are you looking for a sparking point in the conflict or a turning point, or like how could you know which scene is the best one to start?
You mean in terms of how to start the story?
Yeah.
So I look for what they call the inciting incident. What is the element? What do you see about this character that will have to change within themselves? And it's very tiny and short. It's very hard. I'm new to short stories. It's very difficult to put in that inciting incident and then go with it. And you can see that in Echoes of Sonia. The inciting incident is basically a space fight, but there are things that come out of that at the end of it that you see, hey, there's something going on. He's not just fighting space pirates just to be fighting space pirates. As much fun as that is. So I think it's that inciting incident about the character that's in the story that you want to understand. Why is he doing what he's doing? And go from there. That's my only advice.
So you take your character and you're looking for how is he going to change by the end of the story. What kinds of forces could change him in the direction that you want to go in?
It could be an action that he takes or doesn't take. It could be something that happens to him that he has to overcome. Of course, The Martian is probably a good example of man versus nature, right? He's, for lack of a better term, fat, dumb, and happy on Mars, enjoying himself. And a storm hits, and then he's speared through his chest or through his suit, and the ship takes off without him. That's the exciting incident. I'm stuck on Mars all by myself. How does he have to get through that, right? And he doesn't really change as a person. He just overcomes, and I think that's where good progressive pacing will move you forward. And sometimes a character doesn't, you see them encounter something at the beginning of the story that doesn't change them, but then they go through a progressive different arc of story, and at the end they're a different person than they were at the beginning. Oftentimes that's where I've seen a couple of examples of villains who become allies, right? And then, or heroes that become villains, right? They start out very good and progressively decline, and that's the tragedy story, right? That's the there's a term for it. It's a genre term for a person that ends kind of on a down note at the end.
Yeah, tragedy, but maybe a pseudo hero.
Mm-hmm.
That's not quite right, though. A pseudo hero is like a guy who looks good at the beginning, but actually he actually is the villain.
Mm-hmm.
Like
he has to do something that breaks him a little bit,
right.
But he has to do it for a very particular reason, and that's a really hard story to tell. It's a hard story to tell because it's very easy to get that wrong. So,
like Anakin becoming Darth Vader.
I was never happier when he put the mask on.
Never happier. You're like, yes.
No, not because I wanted to see him as Darth Vader. I just wanted to stop seeing.
Oh.
Right?
Oh, there's that too.
Well, so I think that's probably one of the biggest issues, and everybody has seen the entire prequel trilogy. The problem with the issue with the prequel trilogy is that you see the decline of a character. Mm-hmm. That's not exciting. You see him go from being the chosen one to being basically Lucifer.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? How do you enjoy that at the end? The only thing that you can hang on to is that the story is not over and that his son takes up the mantle and redeems him. So that's the saving grace of the prequel trilogy, is knowing what comes next. So I don't think coming out of the gate, if George Lucas had written or had done The Phantom Menace, it would have really done well in the theaters at all.
So if you could rewrite his character, if he was suddenly in your hands and those movies and books hadn't been published, what could you do that would be fun with him, as opposed to just giving him this downward spiral?
I would have probably just not bothered with telling Darth Vader's decline. I don't know, at least not from his perspective. I would have kind of gone like maybe an Obi-Wan pursuit, because you see along the way that Obi-Wan makes mistakes, but Obi-Wan still overcomes his mistakes and defeats him as Darth Vader, right? He cuts off 3 out of 4 of his limbs. I have the high ground. There's tons of memes about the high ground on the internet.
So you'd have looked at like the characters available and picked one that's more interesting to you, that's more fun for you.
That would have given you more of a lens of I guess the world as it is, right? So all you see is his conflict, and his conflict really doesn't start until Attack of the Clones, right? His mother is brutally murdered, right? So, and that's the giant turn for him, right? That's where he decides, I will do whatever it takes. Right? So,
in your books, what kind of main characters inspire and interest you?
In my books, and Ellen could probably attest to this, in my recent works, I'm interested in characters that don't lose themselves in the heat of battle. Mm-hmm. They keep their heads, they keep in control, they aren't emotionally they're emotionally involved, but they're not emotionally overreactive, overly dramatic. I think that's probably something that bugs me with some of the modern cinemas, where you have an admiral, say, of Comp Subland, who is Gary Oldman, yelling at people. Yeah, you know, admirals don't very rarely yell anymore.
So you want an admiral who is even keel.
Yes, you want. There you go. Oh, that's pretty good. Actually. Yeah, you want characters that that are smart, and they're smart in ways that are realistic. They're not just what they call book smart, right? They understand the political situation. They understand the military situation. They understand even what they are getting into. It's like, I'm getting into a really bad situation, but I will continue because there's an ultimate good on the other side, and they make that choice consciously. They're not, whether or not they're forced into it, they still make the decision to go, to go walk down that path. And those are interesting characters to me. The characters that choose to do the right thing, despite the fact that they may have to do some bad things along the way. Those are the characters I like. So.
Have you had any characters where, like, despite all of their best efforts, doing the right thing, it still kind of fails in the end?
Yes. In my first series, not really much of a spoiler alert, because it's Arthur Ray Legend based. I have a character who is very much like the Arthur himself, and he is so compared to Arthur the character that he is constantly judged on that metric, and he falls short, even though in many ways he's a superior. He is smarter, he's well educated. Arthur is just a former Navy SEAL that kind of fell into the technology that exists. And this character is almost exactly the same. Plus, circumstances continue to drive him towards to be the villain. Right? He never desired to be whatever anybody wanted him to be, except just wanted to be valued as a person. And he's a character that continues down this dark path of being the villain, even despite him not being the villain previously. And there was only one moment in the book where he, I would say, redeems himself by doing one thing good, and nobody realizes that except the character that he does it to.
So your plots sound like they've got a lot involved. Do you plot them all out before you start writing? Like, are you a plotter, or
yes.
Involve?
I can't deeply plot. I find huge value in discovery writing. I'm not a pantser because I don't. I have to know where I'm going, in other words, to walk down the path. Some people are just fine wandering around the woods, and if they show up next to a lake and that's where they want it to be, great. But I also don't over outline, because I have done that before, and I've started writing, and the story has kind of taken on new dimensions because there are missing elements in the story that I didn't realize were in it that needed to be in the outline, so I've had to rework the outline. But I need enough to write the story, and enough to know, and enough room to discover and write. That's happened quite a few times in the last couple of books.
Where do those elements come from? Like, do you see something in the news or read a book and you're like, oh, that just sparked an idea for what my character could do to get out of this situation? Or is it something that, like, you can't fall asleep without thinking about your story, and then just an idea pops in? Like, where do these new elements for your plot come from?
Do I have an example of where my ideas come from? Just here it is.
Yes. Example.
This is where my ideas go.
Nice.
I write, and I think I've shown and shared on Facebook multiple times, or a few times, that I write every day. by hand, 3 pages a day.
Wow.
And what I've found of value in doing that, and people that are outliners, people that are deeply think about their stories and write it all down on their computer, is I will not reject an idea if I haven't written it down. I will often explore an idea that I know is bad, but if I continue to write the idea down, it's on paper, it's out of my head, I can examine it objectively and then actually follow the thread, and actually it's like an onion. I can peel like, well, what did I like about that was good? What sucked, for lack of a better term? What sucked? What if I did this? What if I did this? And maybe half a page later, I've come upon a new idea. And then that goes into the outline, and I've got a new piece of story. I do that every day. So.
Does handwriting add an element for you that typing wouldn't?
I think it does. I think it forces me to slow down, and I don't have to write I don't write the story when I write the pages. I write about what I'm writing about. So this is kind of an area where I can just let my mind just think about whatever's on my mind. I put it down on the paper. It could be something that's bugging me that's not writing related, or it can be an event, something that's happened to me recently, and I want to talk about it. And sometimes that just sparks a new idea. This is not a new concept. I think it came from what was that book? I think there's a novel that talks about doing daily writings every day. They call it daily pages or morning pages. I think it's called morning pages. And I just call it daily pages because I don't like to write by hand in the morning. I do it late at night, actually, before I go to bed. It's kind of a, like the day journal, night journal, whatever it is. Just write 3 pages, and you can see my handwriting is very tiny. So 3 pages takes me about a half an hour. So that eats up some time. So I really try to block off a little 20 minutes, 30 minutes of my day to get through 3 pages written down on this tiny little notebook. So,
is that also like reflecting on what happened that day and where your thoughts are?
Yeah, it's reflecting on my day, what's on my mind for the day. It's on my mind. Oftentimes it's on my mind what's in the story, what's not working when I'm writing. So I wrote this scene and it's not working. It doesn't end right. So how can I end it? Can I cut the scene short? How do I keep going with writing a story? That's what I do. I'm very new at this, but I've been plugging away at the daily writing for about 3 years. I think I think the day I decided to start writing to finish the novel, to publish the novel, that's when I started the daily pages, was to keep track of how I was doing. So.
Has it kind of helped you as a person at all?
Yeah. Yes.
Mindset?
I'm a very big fan of developing habits. Writing is a habit. So doing daily pages forces me to write about writing, which forces me to actually write. So if I write in my book that I didn't write that day, after a couple of days, I'll be like, I need to write something because I can't write about not writing. So
all right, I like that. Post-its. That's a really good idea. I've got all these blank notebooks everywhere, filled up. Dean Floyd, he says that's a great practice for capturing ideas. Jot it down, then ask questions, challenge the idea. Very cool.
Yeah, you have to challenge your ideas. This particularly gets into when you get good, and I'm not saying I'm good by any stretch of the imagination, but good writers will take a trope, and a good writer will put the trope in the story, but a really good writer will put a trope in the story and then turn it in a way that you did not expect. Very good recent example is, have you read Stephen Ames's, or Nicholas Ames's Kings of the Wild? I cannot recommend it enough. I'm still right in the middle of this book, and I'm just laughing all the way through it because it's just a great fantasy. But he takes the bar fight trope and turns it just a little bit in just a very humorous way. So.
All right, now a little bit ago, you said you were a great writer. Ellen Campbell sings your praises. And
thinks I do okay.
So how have you gotten to the point where you're at in your writing prowess? Like how have you developed your writing chops over the years? It's been particularly helpful for you?
Yeah, particularly one thing is particularly helpful for me, and there's tons of good writing books out there and writing methods out there, but you find the one that works for you, and then you adapt that and you shape it to yourself. I know Stephen King is just a fan of. He's a pantser, right? And you see the effects of that. I think there's very, very many comments, and I really enjoy Stephen King, but a lot of people say he doesn't have very good endings. They don't land very well because he just kind of gets and then he stops. And I think Neil Stephenson also has some comments to that effect as well. And they're both fantastic writers in their own right. But you've got to find the method that works for you. And what has been working for me is Sean Coyne's story grid.
Oh yeah, I love the story.
And you can't use it at the beginning. You have to use it after you have your first draft. So you write your outline. I write my outline in a spreadsheet. I track it. I write the first draft, and then I go and use the story grid to go, oh, what did I screw up? And how do I flesh out, rework the outline, rebuild the outline, and then rework the story, which means I'm a very slow writer because I do multiple drafts.
That's really good, the multiple drafts. Now, I like that you brought up the story grid. Scott Moon is also a huge fan of the story grid.
I'm a huge fan.
And, if anyone hasn't looked into it before, there's a book, there's a podcast. I think the podcast is in like its 4th, 5th year. They've been Sean Coyne and Tim Grahl have been going strong with the podcast. They've got editors, they've got a lot going on. But basically, with the story grid, you plot out each scene in your whole book. That's kind of like step 1 is to plot out what the basic scenes, the basic event is in each scene. But then to look at how the characters progress emotionally and in terms of the theme kind of throughout the whole.
Yep, there's polarity shifts and then there's also value shifts. And when I write the first draft, none of that is in the spreadsheet. It's literally just scenes of what I want to happen from beginning hook to the ending payoff. And I'll write that. And then I'll come back and start evaluating how I wrote that. And that's where I think I get better.
So you write your first draft, you plot out what all the scenes are, what the events in the scenes are, and then you read your first draft and you're noting the polarity and the value shifts.
Yes. Yep.
Now, what's the difference between polarity? What does that mean to you, polarity?
I think the polarity shift is how the scene ends. Like it goes from negative to positive, or positive to negative, or from negative to really negative. So it's like it's the bad to worse, right? You're like, how can this get any worse? And then it does, right? When the character says that, that's what happens. And then the emotional change is the change in the character. And that's the character's arc, right? They go from, and then you got the shift positive to negative. Well, that means the character goes from succeeding to failing, or from life to death. Something that is an adjective that defines what the character is going to and from. So, and that's very, at least for me, it works for me so far. I'm not saying I'm only 4 books in, but it works for me to understand, do I see that the character, at least for me as the writer, is changing as a character or is seeing that value shift? And if he doesn't see that value shift, I need to change that or evaluate that the value shift actually is useful. Because if you have a lot of negative to positive, you can't have a negative to positive constantly. It has to go up and down. You have to see a bit of a cyclic change to go along the arc. That's kind of what you need, right? So,
what are some of those examples of values that you could be looking at in your story?
So I have, there's a value, for example, of a character goes from succeeding on their mission to failing on their mission. So a character gets into starts combat, is succeeding in combat. wins at the battle, and then something catastrophic happens to him or her at the end that is not related to the battle, but that throws you into the next scene. That's a value shift. Or you win the battle, lose the war, right? I won the battle, but my ship is pretty much crippled.
Yeah.
So, big fan of story group.
So, sorry, not to get it first. So you've plotted out, what your scenes are, and now you're reading through your manuscript again, and you're looking for those shifts. And then you go ahead and you mark down in each scene, is it getting worse? Is it getting better for my characters? Whatever.
Yeah. So
and then what's the pattern? What's the pattern?
Before I write the outline. Mm-hmm. I'll write the manuscript, and then I read the manuscript, and then I'll just evaluate the manuscript itself. So if there's no value shift, I'll write nothing. I'll highlight it in yellow saying there's no value shift here, or there's no emotional change here to the character or to the story. There may often be what I said before, which is like it goes negative to positive, negative to positive. I need a change. I need another scene in there if I want to do these two scenes, or I need to flip one of these scenes to give you that cyclical feel in the story. So
if everything's like staying good for 2 scenes in a row or 3 scenes in a row, then you're like,
it's probably not good, because the reader's getting bored. They want to see something changing, and it's very hard to do when you have multiple POV characters, right? So if you have one character that's going positive to negative, and then you change the value shift in the next chapter, you still need a negative to positive, even though the character is different. So,
right, because then you might end up with a single POV character, and you're flipping back and forth between POV characters, where the one POV character is just getting worse and worse and worse for them.
Mm-hmm. You could do that, yeah. You have to balance that. I have a habit of writing multiple POVs, which is probably not good for starting writer. If you have a single POV story, that's very good, very easy to follow, even if it's third or first person. But when you have multiple point of views, you have to follow the value shifts. And the scenes can be as short as the scenes can be very short, or they can be very long. I think my first novel had some badly long scenes of about 8,000 words. That's a very long. And
you're like, oh.
I find that on average, the good scene length for me is around 1,500, 2,500 words. If there's a lot of action going on, you want to just add value, add what's the scene, not just add words.
So tracking this kind of forces you to think about the reader's experience.
Yeah. So the first, as everyone always says, you write the first draft for yourself, and then every successive draft is for the reader, for the audience, right? So it's fun to write the first one, and I enjoy revision. Probably maybe not every, although I accept almost every bit of her changes, but I enjoy the revision because now I can read my own story as a book and have to put it down for a while, and then maybe do something else. Maybe write a short story, write another story. Get out of the head of the writer and then become the reader, and then kind of grade myself on how I write the story, and then come back into the story and take it. As Sean Coyne talks about it in papers, is take your manuscript, rip it apart, into the pieces, mark it up, and then put it back together. Right. So.
What's it like getting your manuscript back from Ellen, or just from any editor? But what's it like getting it back and it's been edited, and then reading what they've done?
It's hard to read with all the markups, of course, but it's great after you accept all of Ellen's edits, or 99% of them, to go back and compare the two stories. Whether or not you've done a developmental editor, a content editor, a line editor, it's always good to evaluate the quality of the story, beginning and end. Right? I love seeing how the story gets better from an editorial perspective. It's like, oh, that was a good scene, but now it's just really tight. But I cut myself. The novel's now shorter by 2,000 words, but it's great because I like tight writing, good scenes. So. I think the first novel that I wrote took 9 drafts, and yeah, Invisible Enemy took 3 drafts. So it was the first writing, the rewriting, and then when Ellen got a hold of it and rewrite that, and then of course reviewing is just fixing missing words and typos. That happened to happen regardless of how many times you look at the thing. So technology.
Now, the official advice for authors is to go through track changes and to read through each one and accept or reject each one, and that's the very proper way to do it. The other way to do it is just to click accept all, and then read through it. Which one do you do?
I go through each one because there are very, very few, maybe 10 out of maybe 1,000 that might be a question on the word that I won't accept. But I need it. I mark it because I know I need to go back and do something like that sentence because it's clear to me, not clear enough to the reader or the editor. So I need to fix it or delete it. So I can do that. I'm happy with deletions.
Yeah, I think that sounds like the ideal thing that an editor is looking for, is that the author either loves the changes, that's great, or they think of something even better, and that's amazing.
Yeah, Ellen, nobody's standing around looking at things anymore. My characters look at a lot of things because they're just sitting on a ship looking at what's going on. And if you ever stood watch on a ship, it is a whole lot of standing around.
So you're pulling from real life in your stories.
Yeah. She's like, no, don't do that. That's boring. I agree.
Well, like you said about the story of someone sliding into darkness, not the most exciting to read, and the story of someone staring at the wall,
I don't know if it could be exciting. It should be interesting, right? You want to understand why somebody becomes the bad person that they are. I don't think that resonated very well. Not to go back to that example, I don't think it resonated very well, but it was a story that was good to tell. I mean, we've got those stories before. I think I mentioned that already. Lucifer is the fallen angel. How did that happen? Well, something must have happened to make him, be upset with the way things are. Look at Tolkien's stories, right? How did Sauron, become who he was? And it just didn't come out of nowhere saying, "Not bad."
Right.
He wanted to, do things his own way. It's the right way, the wrong way, and the really, really wrong way. Really, really bad way. So.
All right. Well, any last advice to the authors out there, especially to new authors that are figuring out their writer's journey?
So I guess there's probably a lot of back and forth on whether or not writer's block exists. A lot of people say, "Oh, I have writer's block," or a writer's block is not a thing. Okay, I don't care if you believe that it exists or not. And make the habit though. Write something. I will tell you, my first NaNoWriMo that kind of got me on the path of being serious about writing. The daily goal was 1,667 words. The first 1,000 were garbage. The first 1,000 to get into a rhythm of feeling like the story is going. This last NaNoWriMo that I did, I felt like it took maybe 100, 150 words, which is not a lot. It's half a page of printed word. But that's just because you write, and what you want to do is to keep turning the switch on your head. There's a lot of jokes out there, right? Can't wait for the muse to come to you. You have to go find her with a club, right? But my thoughts is you write. It's very much Stephen Pressfield's, right? You write, you show up. The muse will eventually start sitting down next to you and looking over your shoulder. So don't let writers the thought of not thinking about something to write, not an excuse not to write something. So try to write something. Set yourself a tiny goal every day to write 150 words, maybe. I think Stephen King even said that, right? Write 300 words a day. In a month, you'll have a novel, right? That's 300 words a day. That's 6,000 words. In a year, you'll have a novel.
Wow.
But challenge yourself. And I challenge myself every year. I get to this time of year where we're very reflective. We're in holiday spirit. Everybody wants to spend time together and be with each other. But I think about what I did this year, and I don't. Everybody said, shoot for the moon. I was like, no, I want to get over the next hurdle. What's the next hurdle, right? Which is writing a little bit more or publish a little bit more or get a little bit better. And before you know it, you'll look back on a couple of years of successive progressions of step improvements and realize, wow, I'm way better than I was. I sucked so bad at the beginning. I suck a lot less now. Yeah, I got better. Give yourself things that are what they call them. I think Josh even mentioned it, which was SMART goals, right? Or maybe it was Chris Fox, right? SMART, measurable, actionable, repeatable goals, right? I forget what the T is, but you've got to set your bar. So don't, if you feel like you've got writer's block, do what I do and write about how much it sucks to write today. Or how much you didn't have time to write today, except that you spent time to write the fact that you didn't have anything to write. And you want to say, I didn't write because this character has a problem. Well, what's the wrong with my characters? If you write that out, what's wrong with my character? What's he or she missing? And you keep going, and before you know it, you've written 4 pages, and it's actionable material. Okay?
You've got some writing done.
Yeah, you got something done. It's probably not going to go into your manuscript, but you've probably broken the wall to move forward. I wish I could write as often and as fast as Rick or Scott or Josh, but I can't. Not yet.
There's only one way to get there.
Yep. Keep going. Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Thanks,
all right. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with the audience, sharing your experience. Thanks for everyone in the live chat for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Ellen and Dean and Walt. Shadow. Yep.
Yeah, Walt, go back and go watch Galaxy Rangers again. You may or may not be disappointed. I would still enjoy it.
All right. Where can our readers and viewers find you and your books?
I'm on Facebook, Ken Britz. That's pretty much how you can find me. You can find me on Goodreads. You can find me on my website, kenbritz.com, and on Amazon. I'm on all the websites. So I'm all the things. I'm even on Twitter. Probably a little bit harder to find on Twitter. But
all the things and then
all the things. If you can spell my name, you can find me.
Ken Britz.
Ken Britz, that's right.
Okay, this has been another Keystroke Medium chat. Join us on Thursday for the Writer's Journey, where we'll talk about some reading, writing, and everything in between right here on Keystroke Medium.
Happy holidays, everyone. Bye.